Please join me for the responsive reading. I am being driven forward into an unknown land. The wind from my unknown goal stirs the strings of expectation. Still, the question, shall I ever get there? There where life resounds, a clear, pure note in the silence. My name's Amy Preston. I am a new member of Fountain Street Church, class of 2015. And at my age, it's nice to be able to reference 2000s instead of the late 1900s. I found my way to Fountain Street for probably questionable motives. My first reason to come to Fountain Street Church was because I wanted my cat to attend church. And we have that reverence ceremony here, and he'd been hanging out with a bad crowd. I thought it'd be good for him. So I brought him here to Fountain Street, but at the same time, I wasn't quite crazy about going to church, so I went to the chapel service, and just because I wanted to get it done with. But it turned out that I really liked what was happening in chapel. And as I was pushing my cat away that first time I came to Fountain Street in a stroller, because I'm kind of crazy, I thought, you know what, maybe I belong here. And it turns out that we say that a lot here. But I was looking for reasons not to belong. And it happened in the summer series because I was comfortable at chapel. I'd never been to sanctuary. And then we do something in the summer where we combine the sanctuary people and the chapel people, and we have one service, and it's a summer series. And I'm like, this is going to be where I don't like it. But you know what? I loved it. It was great. We have great speakers. You get to see people you don't really see that often. And the summer went by very fast. It was like church summer school for adults. It was wonderful. And then I remember one time Elizabeth was doing something in chapel for us, and she got up there and she was going to read some poetry or recite some poetry. And I'm like, I don't do poetry. That's not me. This is where it's going to go bad. But it turns out that apparently I had just been listening to it wrong because it was really good and it hit the point and it was a very, very good message. And I'm thinking, this is turning out well. So then I figured I better check out this Fred dude. And I came to Sanctuary after chapel, so I was doubling up. And I sat in the back of the class because that's the type of student I am. And I listened to him, and I can't remember for the first or the second time, but at some point, I was so engrossed, I reached for the remote control because I needed to go back in time a little bit to see what he said, because I'm thinking, no, he's wrong about something. But it turns out you can't go back in time when it's live. So I thank the AV people here who put everything on YouTube because it's great. It's great. And I was able to go back on YouTube, and it turns out he made great sense, and I totally agreed. And I'm thinking, after all this time, where I didn't know if I belonged, it's true, I belong here. And I know that sometimes we say you belong here so often it might dilute the sincerity of the message, but it doesn't. It's just true. And this is a part of the service where I'm supposed to welcome you all here, but I want to flip it a little bit. And I want to thank you all for welcoming me here. This is a wonderful, wonderful church. You're great people. And I love what you do for the community, and thank you very much. Welcome to Fountain Street.
to awaken, pique, aggravate, stimulate your thoughts before I open up an idea. Some words from other sources. In the Jewish tradition, the scriptures are read through a cycle of 3 years that don't line up with the Christian reading of the same cycle, and so I tend to use that division more than the Christian lectionary when it comes to the Jewish scriptures. This weekend, a passage from the book we call Numbers was on deck, and part of that passage, too long to read here. It goes, "On the day that the tabernacle was set up, a cloud covered the tabernacle. It was always so. The cloud covered it, appearing as fire by night, and whenever the cloud lifted from the tent, the Israelites would set out accordingly, and at the spot where the cloud settled, there the Israelites would make camp." Now you know where the title comes from, right? Okay. In the Gospel according to Mark, called for in the Christian lectionary, there is a passage that you know from another location. "If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand." A passage unattributed but embedded deeply in President Lincoln's remarks to Congress during his presidency. And as I have promised, in my desire to keep the, well, shall we say, the issue of law enforcement violence and the plight of people of color in this country in front of us each week, let me let you know about Akai Gurley, who at the age of 28 was shot in a dark stairwell last November 20th, 2014. Police Commissioner William Bratton of New York called him a, quote, "total innocent." The cop who was standing beside the officer who fired doesn't know what happened. The girlfriend doesn't know what happened. There is a distinct possibility that the officer that shot him doesn't know quite what happened. On February 11th, the officer who did shoot him, though we don't know why, was indicted. So thank you to my colleague Jason for reminding you that in my absence I was trudging through China, something Marco Polo did and took many years, and the monk and the Monkey King did for 16 years. I was only there 3 weeks. I didn't cover quite the distance they did. And yes, it is a pilgrimage, but pilgrimage is larger, I think, than Jason suggested. It is a journey to a place, and it's almost invariably a journey from that place back. And it may or may not be a place everyone regards as a destination for others. It is a place that's important for your wholeness. So we all make pilgrimages. If you go back to see your grandmother or your grandfather, if you go back to the family homestead, if you hear "Sing, O Heavens," these are forms of pilgrimage that take us toward a point of purpose and value. I was offered the opportunity to find these places in China through the good agencies of some members of this church, and I was grateful that the governing board allowed me to take advantage of that offer. I will tell you from time to time what happened. I will not be like John Jackson, who I believe, former minister here, went away every summer to Europe and came back and preached a number of travel logs. You can find those on YouTube on your own. I'm going to tell you about what happened, not what I saw. I should tell you that as the plane was finally descending into Beijing after a 12-hour flight, the air, even 100 miles away, was like downtown Los Angeles 30 years ago. Deeply hazy, hard to penetrate. 10 minutes after leaving the airport, I was in a car going to my hotel, arranged in advance, and suddenly we were stopped in bumper-to-bumper traffic that did not move for some time. My second experience of China. And then when we finally made it to the city, it seemed to go on and on and on, which makes sense when you think it's a city of over 20 million people, third largest in the world. Despite all my reading, all my research, all my plans, nothing prepared me or could prepare anyone for the immensity of China. It is enormous in every sense of the word. I know it's almost exactly as large as the United States in square miles, but that's only if you sew Alaska onto the west coast to get a sense of the size of its landmass. But more impressive than that are the people. 4 times as many as here in the United States. And the best way to describe that is imagine that every town, every village, every city was 4 times larger than it is now. Think of Grand Rapids being Chicago. Think of the cars. Think of the traffic. Think of the noise. Everything was larger. Everything was busier. Everything was further away than I had expected and anticipated. My first day, for example, I said, hey, I can walk from my hotel to Tiananmen Square, and then I can visit the Forbidden City just north of that, and the famous drum and bell towers that are just north of that. I was wrong. I did one of those things. Tiananmen Square was only a mile away, but when you arrive, you don't realize until you really notice it that it's the size of 50 football fields all together. And it was a Saturday, and so everyone in Beijing seemed to want to be there at that time. All of them wanting to visit Mao's mausoleum. I made a point of saying I'd visit him when he was less busy. The Forbidden City is just beyond it, so I said, I'll go there. And yes, it is twice the size, so it looked less crowded, but it was not less crowded. They were just spread out a little more. It's 180 acres. The wall that goes around it, if you were to walk it, is 2 miles. It's got a lot of buildings in it, over 8,000 rooms. They're not all open to the public. And every one of them has at least one Chinese person in it. It was a full experience, so that by the time I was finally on the other side, ready to leave, going through the gates that looked more like cattle corrals to get us all to leave in an orderly fashion, the thought of walking another mile or so up the road to see these other 2 towers became, shall we say, undesirable. But I had to go home. And so I ended up walking back around one side of the Forbidden City and down alongside Tiananmen Square. I did a good 8 miles that day. My feet complained. Not what I expected. And neither, on the other side of that scale, was the very first church I served, at which I arrived 35 years ago this summer. The town of Petersham, Massachusetts is so small that I doubt anyone in this room other than me has heard of it. It's a town of, well, when I was there, not quite 900 people. In other words, Fountain Street Church's community is 1.5 times as large as the town I served 35 years ago. But like China, it was spread out. It was spread out over 28 square miles. When I went pastoral calling, I took survival supplies. I arrived there filled with the knowledge of a great university located in a great city and expected my experience to be different than that, and it was. But it was more different than I expected it to be. And I have to tell you, that's where I got my real education in clergy life. I knew the theology, I understood the ethics, I comprehended the history, but no one had told me in seminary how to write a newsletter, run a mimeograph machine, how to wind the clock in the steeple, how to visit a nursing home, how to conduct a funeral for someone you know. These were the things I had to learn there. That's how wrong my expectations were, that I had thought that I knew what I was doing. The reality is, I must tell you, and you know this as well as anyone else, that every job we have is a graduate course reminding us of how little we actually know. We're all in the same boat. If you've been a parent, it didn't turn out as expected, did it? Often better, but not what you planned. And if you've been married, chances are that didn't turn out the way you thought it would either. Even if it's been a long and marvelous marriage as mine has been, I think of it very differently than when I started 38 years ago. But I have to tell you, despite all those things that were more different than I expected, I've only ever been completely disoriented twice. Well, 3 times. One of those was in Weymouth, Massachusetts. Why am I telling you about Weymouth, Massachusetts? Well, it's a little town on the south coast of Boston, and from time to time I would have to drive from my home in the middle of the state to someplace on the south shore, and I would have to get off at Weymouth, Massachusetts. Now, this is someone who prides himself on his sense of direction. If I've been there once, I can get there again, and I don't care how many years later, and I can prove it to you. Except in Weymouth, Massachusetts. I got lost every time I was there. I'm mortified that that one town so turns me around. That was one. The other one was China, without question. I had no idea which way was north or south without looking at a map. Everything was twice as far away. Nothing made sense. I felt completely lost. And the other is not a place, but the changes that are taking place in church life everywhere. I got to tell you, the world I grew up in, and that's a long time ago now, and I grew up a religious liberal, included going to church just about every Sunday. I had no choice. We got dressed up. We went to church. When I come home, I took off my Sunday clothes, and only then could I go out and play. Anyone remember that? Yeah, you do. It was a world that had offering envelopes with numbers on them, committees staffed with women named Mrs. John Smith and Mrs. Bill Jones. By the time I was in seminary, things had changed. Men did not always wear suits, but they did wear coats and ties. Women had their own names, but we still had the envelopes. Committees were then, as they were in my youth and in my boyhood, the levers that moved the church. People joined committees, and they had meetings, and they took minutes, and they did things. And ministers, well, what did they do? They were learned, intellectual, male, and they led their institutions with lofty eloquence and thoughtful sagacity. That was the world I thought I was entering. And I was smart, and I wanted to be sage. But by the time I arrived even in Little Petersham, Massachusetts, it was on its last legs. A colleague in a neighbor church reported how at his first trustees meeting, the men, yes, the men, all stood up when he entered the room. He was not even 30. It's what they did. They never stood up when I showed up, I gotta tell you. Some years after that, an historian of American religion observed that at the beginning of the 20th century, clergy were in a high status, low stress, low paying job. At the end of the 20th century, the same expert confirmed what I noticed, that clergy had gone from that to being a low pay, low status, high stress job. These changes, though, were not unique to the clergy. They're part of what's going on in church life in general, in our society in general. Church life is not what I expected it would be. The role of women obviously has changed rapidly, not just in clergy, but they began to have real lives beyond their homes, beyond their children. And of course, for committees that were entirely filled with Mrs. this and Mrs. that, that meant committees began to change too. Not that churches accepted that fact. They kept trying to get people to join committees. They sometimes succeeded. But one of the things every church I have served, including this one, has bemoaned is people don't join committees. That's one of the changes that's taking place. Those under 40 may not even know what a committee is, or what minutes are, or that you're supposed to meet regularly. Someone under 30, when you talk about pledging, says, they think to themselves, oh, that's like calling the public television station and putting something on your credit card. They have no notion that pledging means, I promise today what I will pay you through an entire year. Now, that's not just ignorance. That's also the reality of our economy when many people under 30, notably, are not sure they will be employed for a year. In what job, at what income? Things were not and are not what we expect. And Sunday, who goes every week anymore? It is an option that plays with festival, sports, lawns, and doing nothing. Church life is not what it was 50 years ago. We all know that, and it's true for everyone, including us, but certainly not just us. I have read that over 50% of all 20-somethings do not seek to go to any house of worship at all. That's a whole generation for whom church is at best peripheral. That does not mean they don't have religious faith. They do. They simply do not feel they have to go to church to get it. Have you seen YouTube? And when a church says that you have to pledge and join to be considered a real member, they are out of here. Even megachurches, those enviable institutions that we all wanted to either ruin or become, are not so mega anymore. They succeeded 30 years ago by being essentially religious shopping malls with great big parking lots and food courts. Anyone seen a new shopping mall go up recently? Or a new megachurch? A little bit like our church, which was built in the downtown big church era, which looked, unsurprisingly, like a department store where people used to go when they went shopping. The religious landscape today is neither of those, and we don't know what it's becoming. It is bewildering, it is disorienting. It's like arriving in China and not knowing which way to turn, which way is up, how far anything is away. And moreover, we have no idea how to get where we gotta go. I don't know, and I'm here to tell you the other thing. Nobody knows. There are experts everywhere. I get my Facebook page filled with posts by ministers of new startup churches telling me how to run my church, how to change my church, how to adapt for the future. They all seem to know everything. I must be the most stupid pastor on the planet because they all know how to fix everything. But I'm here to tell you, after due, prayerful, and intellectual pursuit, none of us know what to do. We're all lost. We're all confused because everything is different and nothing is settled. It's a little bit like Israel in the wilderness. You remember the passage? There we are, Israel wandering around in the desert. You know the story. They escape from Egypt, they get the 10 Commandments, and then they get lost for 40 years. But if you look carefully, the story has other stuff in it you may not have noticed. Among other things, they didn't actually get to the promised land at all. If you get to the end of the Torah, Moses dies and they're still not in the promised land. That's in another book altogether. The passage from this week in Numbers comes from a book, if you're reading in Hebrew, called In the Wilderness, which makes way more sense. And people, like I said, as I implied, sometimes wisecrack about how could people get lost in a desert for 40 years, but they're not lost. The purpose of that journey was different. They were being led around by that cloud that picked them up, moved them over here, put them down, moved them over here, and put them down again. God would not let them enter the promised land. That's something most people miss. Why is that? Well, early in that story, in the book of Exodus, somewhere around the 14th chapter, that's well toward the beginning, they reach the edge of the promised land and send 12 spies into the land of Canaan, one for each tribe. They come back and 10 of them say, the Canaanites are giants, we are like grasshoppers, they spit fire, they do terrible things, we can't go. 2 of them said, yeah, we can do this. God is telling them, you've got to enter the land of Canaan, but they say, whoa, God, they're big, we're small, not going. At which point God says, who are you supposed to believe? 10 guys or me? Israel chose to believe the empirical evidence, the majority report, and God said at that point, you aren't ready. You are just not ready to make this journey. If you're not ready to believe that I will do what I promised I will do, having led you out of Egypt, giving you the law and the commandments, having shot fire and brimstone from one side of the sky to the other, you are not ready to go. And so the cloud led them around in a wandering pattern for 40 years until everyone who did not believe died. The only two people who survived from Egypt to Canaan were Joshua and Caleb, the two spies who said, "Let's go." Interesting. Yeah, they were punished, no question. But there was more to it than that. It was getting Israel ready to take on the task it was unwilling to take on. In the 14th century, a Christian mystic of no known name penned a short tract called The Cloud of Unknowing, telling readers that the way to God was not through knowing God, but through unknowing what you think you know about God and yourself, letting go of certainty and clarity. Sometimes uncertainty is the reality we have to accept. Sometimes there are no evident paths, answers, plans, or experts. Sometimes we are in a cloud, we are in a fog bank, and we don't know the way out. That's an uncomfortable place to be. We all want to get out from the fog and the mist. It was Josh Billings, the early American humorist, who said, "It ain't ignorance that causes so much trouble, it's folks knowing so much that ain't so." We sometimes are so desperate to be certain that we will make something up that we believe to be certain just to deal with the uncertainty, which makes our stomachs turn and makes our heads anxious. We feel weak and worried. But if uncertainty is a reality, certainty becomes the unreality. And that's the hard part we don't like to take. We don't want to admit that our lives, our nation, our world, our churches are in uncertain places. We want to say, "I know where to go and I'm going there." But sometimes that's an act of fear, not an act of courage. If you are here, you probably have experienced the dangers of religious certainty. Can I hear a couple? You realize that sometimes someone said, "This is the way God said it," and you came to realize they were wrong whether they knew it or not. Or that people's certainty turned into a form of oppression. I am quite certain you don't belong here, or I'm quite certain they have to do that. You know the dangers of unwarranted certainty. So I think we can all disagree with William Butler Yeats in his wonderful poem called The Second Coming, that the best do not always lack conviction. If we are uncertain in uncertain times, that's the certainty that everyone should claim. Far from being a weakness, uncertainty, when it is real, is the most powerful position to hold. After all, can you learn when you know it? Can you grow when you have already reached your goal? Anyone here know everything they need to know about life? Raise your hand. So there's some uncertainty in this room even about your own lives. Anyone here know what the country should do for the next election or the next 50 years? Please raise your hand. We will follow you forever. No, uncertainty is sometimes deepest wisdom, because in uncertainty we are willing to change and willing to learn and willing to grow. This may not seem like a powerful position to those who claim to know. They always tell us over the years, I've heard this, "You're not a real church." I want to look back and say, "Oh, we are the most real church there is, dude." It's you who are not dealing with reality, because in reality, uncertainty is ever present. And we're okay with that. Probably more okay with it than anybody else. 35 years ago, in that little town, in that little church that rewrote my programming about ministry. One of my early sermons was called Vision or Clarity. And 35 years ago, I come back to that theme and realize it is still pertinent. What once seemed clear and known in religious matters has become very murky. What was clear and known about politics and about good guys and bad guys has become very uncertain. What was true and obvious about how churches should operate no longer holds. Every part of our life feels hazy and uncertain. And many truly do long for clarity of any kind. And they mistake clarity of opinion for vision of reality. Some will say that we are in uncertain times because we have lost our vision and we have to get it back by going back. How many politicians say we have to take back our country? Well, the only place I've ever been, every time I hear someone say we have to take something back, they're usually telling us we have to turn around and go back to some other almost antebellum state. In Hebrews, the Hebrews in the desert did exactly the same thing. After those spies came back, they raised their hands in a worried cry and said, were it not better for us to return to Egypt, where we had enough food? Let us make a captain and go back to Egypt. I'm here to tell you, every politician, every religious leader, every moral leader who says we have to go back to something else is leading us back to Egypt in whatever form we are trying to escape. There is no alternative but uncertainty, and the only path past the cloud is through it. The parable teaches us to follow the cloud, to engage it, even to welcome it, because we only have one direction available: into the fog, through the uncertainty. If we cannot see clearly, it is no lack of ours. In fact, it is the best vision in the world to believe there is a future even when you don't know exactly where it is. I do not trust those who know the future by saying it was 50 years ago. Neither should you. However crowded, noisy, and smoggy Beijing was, the reality was also that there were people all around me, always. But they were walking their children to school wearing little windbreakers and carrying lunch boxes with Hello Kitty on them. They ate dumplings at little tables on the streets and chatted with smiles on their face. 7 yuan, like we're talking about $1.20 for 8 great dumplings. It was marvelous. They rode motor scooters, lots of them, sneaking in and out traffic, going to work, sometimes taking their children to school. What I'm saying is, despite the haze on the horizon and the immensity of China itself, the people in it were the same people I see here, doing the same things that you do and I do. And when I say, ni hao, they smiled back. They were real, not figments of my imagination. This was also China. No, I can't see the far horizon for the country or the world. I can't even see the far horizon for the church. Nobody can do any of those things, especially those who say they can. But I can see you. And my neighbor, literally my neighbor. I can see that neighbor whether here in Grand Rapids or in Beijing, for that matter. I can see my fellow wanderers in the wilderness, all of us trying to hang on for another day, another week, another year, tending our gardens well or poorly. I can see that all of us, each and every one of us in this wilderness have to hang together, or we will certainly all hang separately, as Franklin said. And if we are to go together through the clouds, we can yet believe the horizon will appear as long as we keep going. The fact that we do not see it does not mean it's not there. And believing it could be there, even when we don't see it, is an act of faith that even the most pious cannot grasp. Let's go together with the cloud. Let's grab the uncertainty as an opportunity for wisdom. Let's be ready to surrender what we know to become what we do not know, and trust that this is enough. It always was, and it always will be. Amen and amen. Shall we join our...